Thank you, Catherine, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's great to be welcoming you to the third deep dive on ecological connectivity, which is organized under the umbrella of the North American Marine Protected Areas Network, or NAMPAN, as many of us know it. Thank you to our organizers, first of all, to the Commission for Environmental Cooperation for its funding, and to EcoAdapt for facilitating this session, and of course to our moderator and our amazing panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today with us. I represent the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, in North America. And for those of you who don't know us, we are the leading agency within the UN system for addressing environmental challenges. We work with countries worldwide to protect our vital global ecosystems. And we are also supporting NAMPAN, working in close collaboration with Canada, Mexico, the United States, and the Commission for Environmental Cooperation to foster a comprehensive network of marine protected areas in North America. Our mission is to create a strong and active network of people and places at all levels to increase knowledge and capacity. And we aim to increase collaboration to better address common issues and build partnerships for integrated conservation efforts. Our main objective is to identify key challenges and opportunities, share information and best practice, and consider how best a North American Marine Protected Areas network can serve your needs. So with that objective in mind, we are here today to connect marine protected area practitioners across national and regional boundaries to create a community of practice on ecological connectivity, which is one of the priority topics that was identified in consultation with many of you. In early 2021, we already organized the first deep dive around this topic, exploring the need for and design of ecological corridors across the seascapes of the three countries. Then later that year, we got together again to share specific projects and best practices on ecological connectivity. And today we will explore barriers and challenges to ecological connectivity, but focusing on transboundary species. And we will identify, hopefully, opportunities for collaboration across MPA networks. You are all managers, experts, and leaders of marine protected areas, and we hope this is a good venue to discuss this important topic. And we hope that today's deep dive will strengthen, as I said, the collaboration and the efforts to support marine conservation with a focus on the ecological, economic, and social connectivity. So again, I wish you a very productive discussion, and thank you so much for joining us. And over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Maria. I would now like to introduce everyone to our moderator for today's deep dive, Mary Collins. Mary is the International Program Conservation Associate at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. She is a climate, marine, and social scientist and expert in coastal and marine connectivity and conservation. She engages at the international level, providing advisory services, technical assistance, and capacity building for policy advancements, on-the-ground connectivity implementation, and expert working groups, including the Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group and the Marine Connectivity Working Group. So I will now give the floor over to Mary, who will moderate our panelist session and introduce us to the topic of our deep dive.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm so pleased to be with you today and excited for our engaging panel and then our breakout sessions. So I will share just a brief recap on marine connectivity first and its expression in global policy, and then we'll open it up to our expert panel discussions. Let me share my screen. One moment. Okay. Can somebody confirm that they can see my screen?
Yes, looks
Great.
good.
Perfect. Thank you.
We're seeing the presenter view, though.
Oh, you are.
Yes.
Let me stop sharing and then I will share my opposite screen really quickly. Oops.
Thank you.
There, I'll shift it over. Thank you for that. There we go. How about now?
Very good. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all for your patience. I like to start with reminding everybody that the interconnectedness of the ocean is one of its defining characteristics. And because of that, when we're conducting connectivity conservation, both on the coast and at sea, we can use it as a scalable tool for planning, management, and measurement in those areas, both to look at the function of the systems and also how they might adapt or already are adapting to climate change. The definition of ecological connectivity is the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. Now, that can be broken into functional and structural connectivity. Functional focuses on the species, their movements, their genes, their gametes, and structural focuses on the non-living, mostly the environments. Today, I believe what we're focusing most on is functional connectivity. So here are a list of terms that in large part include connectivity, such as climate-wise conservation, marine protected area networks, ecological networks. The list goes on, but these tend to be common terms that we see in our day-to-day work that in reality includes connectivity prominently. So why are we focusing on marine connectivity? We have this entire deep dive session and these entire series of deep dive sessions focused to this topic. Well, it's essential to ecosystem function. Ecosystems and species need to be connected to not just function, but also be resilient to disturbances. So a connected system will increase the repopulation rate after a disturbance and also decrease the severity of the disturbance in general. Also, when we're focusing on connectivity, it tends to also increase collaboration between different groups of people across borders, amongst scientists and educators. So in general, it helps us collaborate. So I'm going to transition here to some of the international mechanisms that are supporting connectivity in their reports and in their policies. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, said that the most consistently cited climate change adaptation measure for species is increasing connectivity to facilitate the colonization of new areas. And that idea is reflected in a lot of international law and policy programs that we like to call enabling frameworks. And I'm not going to go into detail of all of these, but what I will do is talk about the Convention on Biological Diversity and the new agreement that was signed by countries very recently. And that's titled the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. If you haven't heard of it, it's a landmark agreement that sets out a suite of goals and targets for countries to advance in the coming years. And what I've done here is I've broken out all of the targets and goals that prominently include connectivity. And I've highlighted that in yellow. And it's important to note that each and every one of these also prominently includes marine ecosystems. So if you want to read more about it, you can follow the link in the bottom if these slides are shared at the end. I can also put it in the chat if needed later. So with the framework comes a monitoring framework. So we not only need to advance these issues for each country, but also to measure the progress. So we have for goal A, target 2, and target 3, indicators that have been proposed for countries to report on progress. Now, not all of these indicators currently are able to measure marine and coastal connectivity, but a working group will work in the coming year to make sure that these targets and goals can be measured throughout environments. So when we're looking at the connectivity between Canada, US, and Mexico, this is relevant for all three. And even though the US is not a party to the convention, it includes extremely similar language within its America the Beautiful policy. So in effect, we'll be working towards this all together. So I want to end this introduction with a few resources that you can all use before I introduce the panel. And that would be, if you would like to join the Marine Connectivity Working Group, you can stay up to date on the resources and policies and also events that are taking place relevant to marine connectivity. And then also you could just go straight to our page where we have those resources available for absolutely anyone who's interested. So with that, I'll stop sharing and introduce you to our first panelist.
Can everyone hear me well?
Hi, okay.
Hi, everyone. I will share my screen. All right. Hi, so my name is Aurore Maureaud, and I'm a postdoctoral associate at the Rutgers University, and I will be talking about the conservation of transboundary marine species. So first, I wanted to recap a little bit about what we mean by transboundary. And mainly we mean shared marine species between different jurisdictions. And in the oceans, there's a range of different cases in which species can be shared between jurisdictions. They can be transboundary between two or more exclusive economic zones. They can be straddling between EEZ and the high seas. They can be only internationally shared in the high seas. They can belong to one exclusive economic zone, but they may sometimes in the future change their distribution and become transboundary. And they can also be highly migratory, and in this case, move from many different jurisdictions to complete their life cycle. And this transboundary component of species spatial ranges is very common in the ocean and is very important when we think about conservation of the oceans. And under climate change, this issue is even more important because species change their spatial distribution in response to changing environments. And that also has a lot of consequences for human activities such as fisheries, which is one of the topics that I work on in my research. And a key example is, for instance, the changing distribution of Atlantic mackerel in Icelandic waters that suddenly occurred with climate change. And that led to a lot of disputes between countries because there were no good agreement that allowed to maintain cooperation in how we manage these species. And that stock ended up being overexploited because of that. And so in my work, I work a lot on how to foster cooperation between scientists and how we share resources among ourselves. I focus on demersal scientific bottom troll surveys that sample fish and other taxa that live close to the bottom of the ocean. And since the end of my PhD, I started to work on how to create a new consortium of people who work with this biodiversity monitoring surveys. So on the photos, I show examples of the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and Iceland waters. And so these surveys, they're conducted in many places around the world. But there was no good way of working together at a large scale and how to change information and exchange data and share resources. And so in my work, I led metadata analysis and collection around the world. And we found all of the surveys that are highlighted in colors that sample fish around continental shelves of the oceans. And this work was partly done with a biodiversity synthesis group that was funded by the French Biodiversity Foundation and the Canadian Institute of Ecology and Evolution, that's called Fish Club, in which we assessed both the existence and the availability of these surveys, and for which we are now working with all of these experts around the world and trying to enhance scientific cooperation. And so this is the leadership group of the Fish Club Consortium that I show. We are around 10 to 15 persons. And we are also creating more resources for the community so that we can enhance the cross-boundary science of marine species, understand their distribution, understand community changes across borders. And so on the map, I show a new database that I put available actually last week online, where we have 26 scientific bottom troll surveys that we combine together so that we can enhance science using these. And so the main aims of this work is first to enhance the research on species and communities that are across borders and under global change, but also to inform sustainable fisheries management and conservation practice. And we're really hoping to develop these efforts in terms of scale, in terms of number of persons involved, and enhance cooperation for management moving forward. And so I think that when we're thinking about conservation and cross-boundary questions, we're really dealing with two different scales and difficulties. The first one is to be able to work across disciplines and stakeholders, from fundamental science, applied science, conservation, governance, fisheries management, but also to be able to navigate all of the cross-jurisdictional scales, whether we're thinking about communities, states, entire countries, multiple countries, or areas beyond national jurisdictions. And the difficulty is to be able to work with these two dimensions. But there are a lot of organizations that exist and agreements that are supposed to foster these collaborations. And that's, for instance, the case of NAMPAN and other organizations that focus on multiple marine protected area networks across borders, international fisheries management organizations for pelagic or deep sea communities, bilateral fisheries management agreements that exist both in North America on the Pacific or the Atlantic side, and important legal frameworks such as the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement Implementation Act that's supposed to work and to foster sustainable fisheries. And so I'm going to end with an inspiring thought and image. So this is a painting I did last year that represents siphonophore, which are composed of many different units of organisms that all perform different functions to sustain and live and survive in the marine environment. And similarly to these organisms, I think all of us need to be able to work together at our own scale and try to enhance cooperation for ocean management. Thank you.
Wonderful. And before we ask you a few questions, I'm going to go through your complete bio because we were able to jump straight into your presentation just now, but I want to make sure everybody hears the full range of your bio. So Aurore is a marine quantitative ecologist working in biodiversity, ecosystems functioning, fisheries, and ocean conservation. She studied fisheries management in France, received her PhD in Denmark, and completed a postdoctoral position at Yale University. She is now working as a postdoctoral associate in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources at Rutgers University. where she focuses on the impacts of climate-driven resources changes in international relations. So there's your full description. Thank you so much. And I'm intrigued to hear a little more. So I do have one question for you, but if anybody in the audience has additional questions, please insert them into the chat and I'll make sure that they are heard. So first off, what is the state of cross-boundary protections? I know you've looked at this in the slides that you shared, but are there differences in the protections for commercial species versus non-commercial species?
Yeah, I think the status is pretty different because commercial species benefit from very different sources and interests and data. I think we have like species with most data and a very strong economic interest. So there is definitely a different focus on commercial species for which there are also more opportunities for conflict that may put them at a different risk than non-commercial species. And I would say that species that are non-commercial tend to be sometimes more rare, or in situations such as highly migratory species where they depend even on more countries than commercial species may do. And I would say that I think the legal framework is very different as well on how you would consider either commercial or a non-commercial species. And I would say, I think that almost for commercial species, we benefit a little bit more from this strong scientific regulation cooperation that we would for non-commercial species, because there is this like stronger interest overall from nations and communities, because there is such a strong economic value for commercial species.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. I also want to ask, what's up next for your research and for your work in this area?
I think there's two main components. The first one is that during my postdoc, I started working with social scientists and policy scientists. So I'm trying to place ecology in a different context around conflicts and climate change. And the second one is try to foster all of the ecological data sets that we've put together for working with conservation practitioners, hopefully. So if some people are actually interested in demersal scientific surveys, then please get in touch with me.
Wonderful. So thank you. And with that, we will move on to our second panelist for today. And that will be Andrew Trites. He is a professor in the Institute of Oceans and Fisheries, Department of Zoology at the University of British Columbia. There, he is also a director of a Marine Mammals Research Institute. His research program involves captive and field studies of seals, sea lions, whales, and dolphins. And his research spans fields of ecology, nutrition, psychology, and also animal behavior. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Thanks very much, Mary. It actually wasn't psychology, it was physiology.
Physiology.
Maybe I got typed down wrong, I'm not sure, or got lost in translation.
There you go.
Let me just share my screen. Hopefully, we'll get started. Okay, so I was going to give you a sort of a very brief overview of a couple of things that come to mind when I was asked to be on the panel and talk about transboundary marine mammals. And what you're seeing here is one of the studies I've done. A lot of my work has been with stellar sea lions, which range from California all the way across the Aleutian Islands to northern Japan. And part of our work was to bring in young animals, train them, and then this was one of our female sea lions that was trained to do open ocean swims with us, to collect data in ways to bridge this gap between what we know in full captivity versus what we know from watching them in the wild. When we think about transboundary marine mammals, I think you have to point out that almost all of them, with a few exceptions, are transboundary. The other important thing, and so I've just put on here some species from the North Pacific, some of the ones that I'm most familiar with. And it's important to keep in mind that many of our species are still recovering from overexploitation. Some are better known than others, but for the most part, all were the subject of very heavy hunting. And now we still have some that are still the focus under consideration for culling. So a case in point is one species which was heavily hunted in the 1700s and 1800s. In fact, it was thought to be extinct until a party coming from the Smithsonian Institute discovered 8 of them in 1892 in Mexico. And of course, I don't have a picture from that time, so this is Teddy Roosevelt, who's standing in for the northern elephant seal. But the species that they rediscovered after thinking was extinct, they ended up shooting 7 of the 8 of them. Because believe it or not, that in Washington, D.C., they didn't have any in the museum yet. And this was the last chance to get them before they were officially extinct. Of course, we've come a long way since then. Here, we've got a species, this is mom and dad, the northern elephant seals. They breed in California and Mexico, but you can see that their migration routes take them up into Canadian waters, up into Alaskan waters. And they do this migration for feeding and other purposes twice a year. So they cover a huge part of the ocean. They tend to be more offshore, but even in Canada, we're seeing some come into the Salish Sea next to Vancouver. We've even had a few pups born there in the last few years as well. Another species which has caught my attention is the Guadalupe fur seal. I'm currently, while I'm based in Vancouver, BC at the University of British Columbia, I'm in fact today in La Paz, Mexico, because I'm on sabbatical. And I started this 7 years ago to become better informed about the species which we share with Mexico, true transboundary species. And this is one in particular, the Guadalupe fur seal, which it too was thought to be extinct until it was around 1956 when 14 were rediscovered on Guadalupe Island. And since then, the population has increased, and there's now about 35,000, but they're still restricted to just one breeding island, but they're beginning to expand. So here is a map showing in various colors breeding sites where they're extinct and where we think they will recover. But we now have them showing up quite frequently in Washington State, also very frequently in British Columbia. But no, in Canada, we don't consider them to be a Canadian species. They're considered to be vagrants. And that's because there's just no history of them. They've been gone for so long that the reappearance is seen as being very odd. Another species which more people are familiar with are the California sea lions. And I'll show here in this map, breeding locations in Mexico and in California, but you can see that they migrate, at least the males do, up into Canadian waters, where unfortunately we have some people calling them an invasive species and wanting them removed. And there's a lot of political pressure at the moment to see culling start on something that many people are viewing as being an invasive species, when in fact, they were there long before any people were. And there's evidence of them in the middens. And finally, I've got here on here gray whales. And should you be fortunate enough to be down in Mexico, it's quite an unusual behavior with mums with calves, or will even push calves towards vessels. They seem to be very much at ease. But when you look here at their breeding range, so down at the bottom is where the calves are born, way up north is where they feed. And the amazing thing for a female that's pregnant is she has to feed not only to support her pregnancy, but she has to store essentially 6 months worth of milk before leaving to come down to feed her calf, because she's getting nothing as she goes down and nothing until she gets back up north again. And we have some of these animals are resident in British Columbia and Washington State. They over summer there, they're not going all the way back. And finally, I just want to mention the southern resident killer whales, which is another population I've been focused quite heavily on. And this is a population which as it's ranged from California up into British Columbia waters. But if you read the news, you think that they only exist in the Salish Sea. That's where all the attention is, when in fact, this is where they're seen most frequently historically in the summer and fall, but very little thought has ever been given to where they are when they're not there. And we've a lot of time and effort and money being spent on trying to figure out what's wrong with the Salish Sea for them, when in fact, I think the problem is further south in California. So a couple of take-home messages for me. One is that keep in mind that the recovery of marine mammals does not mean that they are invasive or vagrant species. We need to keep in mind that animals are coming back. We have, for example, in the Salish Sea, humpbacks that have returned after 100 years. They too are not an invasive species. They've come back to what was always part of their range. Another thing on here I've called the Oinby, only my backyard. And what I find here with marine mammals is, and I think the southern resident killer whales is a perfect case in point, is that out of sight, out of mind. And we tend to think of them only about where we know them well. And if you only know about gray whales in the lagoons, you think then therefore it is a Mexican species. If you see them in the summertime feeding in BC, one takes ownership there. But there tends to be little thought given to what all these different backyards are. And the fact is that they all are interconnected. In fact, the life cycles of marine mammal consists of chains of backyards. They require each of these to complete different parts of the life history to make it through the full 365 days. That then brings me to this point here, which is that ultimately the carrying capacities, the number of animals that can be supported within a population, or the ones you might see each summer, fall, winter, spring, depends upon where the weakest transboundary link is. And I know we've got many people online representing many different MPAs. And my question to you is, are you overseeing the weakest link? Or is your link strong and we need to focus on others? Here's some contact information for me. I'd be pleased to talk about this or other things. And we have our Facebook page, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks very much, Mary.
Thank you, Andrew. And with that, I just have two quick questions for you, and we'll let the translators catch up. So I will speak slowly. So in your slides, we've seen a good amount of what appears to be seasonal migrations and transboundary movement for marine mammals. And given this and other mammal behavior, what in your mind are a few things that MPAs and their managers can do to better enable quality habitat throughout their life cycle stages and ranges?
I guess one thing would be that, I don't know, let's say if you're taking gray whales as your species, is just thinking about where are the other MPAs that are part of the life cycle. And it's one thing to protect your piece, but that can be all in vain if the other pieces aren't receiving similar types of protection. So I think it'd be important for whatever species one has is to be aware of what are the other parts in a very large range which they require that one needs to be focused on and pay attention to. I know with southern resident killer whales, for example, I find it very hard to get anybody to think beyond the Salish Sea. And the trouble I see for some of the resident killer whales, it started over a century ago. And I think the Sacramento River in particular was key to their survival. And yet when I talk about the fact that that river system along the Klamath and the Columbia used to account for over 50% of all the Chinook salmon in the North Pacific Ocean, people think that's a fairy tale because it happened before we collected a lot of data.
Very insightful. Thank you. And I want to close this section with asking what's next for you in your research, in your conservation work?
One of the things I'm focused on here while I'm in Mexico is the Guadalupe fur seal. And just looking at the different regulations we have in Canada, the United States, and Mexico to protect them, trying to put together the limited sightings we have of them to make the case of where their range is. It is a species that is returning to its historic range, but people don't understand what the historic range was. So that's one of the projects. The other thing I've been working on a lot is leading a project in the North Pacific focused on food requirements of marine mammals, using a meta-analysis of all species and looking at a concept of the cost of living and evaluating that for marine mammals who have different costs of living. And that's the other part of what I'll be doing while I'm here.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks.
We'll now transition to a short presentation by Elva Escobar Briones. She is a senior researcher in the Institute of Marine Sciences and Limnology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She is a full-time professor and is dedicated to advancing science and knowledge in marine biodiversity of the Mexican deep sea ecosystems to support the design of areas for conservation. She has also been appointed and elected as an expert in support of decision-making, both nationally and internationally. She co-leads the Western Tropical Atlantic Regional Capacity Development Working Group and the Ocean Literacy Working Group, and directs the capacity building projects that are endorsed by the UN Ocean Decade. So with that, I'll turn it over to Elva.
Thank you very much, Mary. And I'll speak actually in Spanish. I would like to support my colleagues from Mexico so that they can follow me with the talk. And I will share my presentation. So please let me know that you can see my screen and that you can follow my voice. Okay. Entonces voy a
Okay,
hablar-
so now I'm going to speak about the importance of the scientific research and the opportunities for collaboration for the topics of transboundary species movement for the conservation and eco-conservation. And I'm going to base this especially in the experience that I have had with the International Authority of Marine, where we had the areas, the ecological and biological, ecological importance, and also in the work carried out by the Commission of Biodiversity, the CBD, for the proposal of I coordinated this in Mexico, made some proposals, and I participated in others where we had the idea of connectivity in the topics. I'm sorry, there's interference. And also to thank, I'm sorry, somebody has the mic open. There's a lot of feedback.
Yo tengo abierto mi micrófono, no sé si alguien más tenga su micrófono abierto.
I think somebody had their microphone open.
¿Puedo dejar de compartir y volver a comenzar?
I can stop sharing. Do you want me to start again? No, you're fine. I think somebody had the microphone open.
Lo que yo quisiera comenzar con esta diapositiva.
I wanted to start with this slide and to inform of the area that is shared by the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And this is a region, a geographic area that is unique and in the frame of scientific research that has generated knowledge on the biological and knowledge of the coastal areas has been basic in such a way that these three images are in the ocean area, it's mainly in the marine area, and it shows how this region in the area of 1998-2008 was one of the areas where there were more requests for research, and we were able to define many of the protected areas and to support many of the knowledge of these, and many of these campaigns were in the middle panel, and many of these regions, when they were in deep areas or unique areas that where we requested the use of robots, and they were carried out in this region. And in the rest of the planet, and in the specific case of cruises in the United States, where they moved. And they talk about the United States because I don't know about Canada too much, but mainly I know where sciences are more local. For example, in the United States and in Mexico, it's local. We have ships that are only local in scope. And this has allowed, because of the location that they have, to generate immediate access at a lesser cost to carry out discoveries and for research. And this allows us to have different resources, mining biodiversity and compounds, and it supports conservation with this knowledge for what is the protected areas. These panels were used to tell us that the hemisphere is very complete, and this is to know, in order to know the area. Also very important in the cycle with financing and with discoveries is that the integration of technology is a very important part, because it has allowed us to understand better the knowledge related to connectivity. In the panel on the left, in the year 2000, with objects like with the collaboration with companies, it was proven this connectivity in the region of the West Atlantic, and this took us and gave way to a project that is called the Oceanic Studies for the Gulf of Mexico, in which knowing the current is very important, because we can understand better how we have contaminants, what are the contaminants, and the side products of oil and any contaminants that are affecting the natural protected areas. This project is in force right now in the School of Sciences. And the marine studies allowed us with technology to know and to follow different species of megafauna, vertebrates, and to see turtles and large fishes and mammals, and how they moved and how they used the ocean. And the best example is the Pacific. And in this one, and we overlap the traditional indigenous knowledge in local communities. A lot of the fisheries of salmon, for example, is very specifically carried out in these sites where we have these migrations and natural movement of the species. Technologies have allowed us also to know this connectivity that exists of the vertical movement of different populations from the deep area to the surface, and the effect of carbon. The new knowledge based on this allows us also to carry out joint collaboration, and this is the example, the Lyson albatross, which has which is in the Pacific, and it allows us to see the colonization sites that has helped us so that species can find different sites where they can be protected. And here, even though the species is fed basically with the surface of the subarctic area, so it is incubated and the calves are born, or the female or the males are fed in the islands of Mexico. And when we see comparatively the knowledge of the surface temperature, the speed of the wind the chlorophyll and the surface of the ocean, we know that these areas are connected and allowed us to define conservation sites for these specific species. Likewise, the question comes up of how could we carry out this transboundary conservation and how can we participate more intensively? And this would be through the exclusive economic areas with the large economic surfaces and in national surfaces and in geographic areas that allow us to have a better diversity areas and to have knowledge of the processes. And we have here two for the Atlantic, for the Pacific. One, we call it, this was proposed by the United Nations, and the other one, and both have very good purposes. One is more fixed, and the other one is has mobility. And this is the euphoric zone, the thermoclina, and the stationary areas of stratification. So this is a topic which is very complex. In the future, with climate change, we're going to have to discuss it a little bit more. And every day we make more use of the ocean, farther, more deep, and each one of the areas has their own jurisdiction, their own laws and legislations, and the risks are greater from the frame of the climate, the use, and the waste that go into the sea and the impact of humanity in general. So it is very important when we talk about climate change is how we are reconfiguring the different species, and especially in the case of the Pacific, something that we share is that the three countries has an area of minimum oxygen, but it's distributed differently in the northern part. It's very deep and very narrow. In the area of California in the United States, it could be very broad, but deep. And in the case of Mexico, it goes from 25 meters to 1,500 meters. And with the climate change, it will be greater. And this would take us to a reconfiguration of many of the species that are commercial in nature, and the composition of the water, the column of water. When Mexico had to make conservation proposals, the three countries, we have a greater proportion of what is called the, I had many questions and I was involved in this proposal of how to propose this if we cannot monitor this, but there are many mechanisms to survey the surface and everything that we can have in the surface, mainly because we have this minimum oxygen zone. It allows us to isolate the deep areas and that the deep areas are not affected. At the same time, we wanted to have a way of understanding the APEIs that are proposed with the marine protected areas, and this is a way of conserving areas that have nodules, marine nodules, and you can see this in the left photograph. And all these areas have an impact, and they have impact because of the climate change, which are the photographs on the upper part. And this is an area that have a greater impact from east to west. And this already started in all this area with the acidification and the reduction of food for the species that live in this area. But in addition to this, we add the extraction of minerals that have mineral plumes. They affect the species and the marine environment. This has not been mentioned, but these areas in Mexico are looking to protect of non-mining and to preserve the biodiversity in these sites. And they simulate in this area, they simulate the APEIs in a transboundary way because the current is going from east to west. So we have opportunities for action, and these opportunities are for sciences within the frame that we currently have in the decade of the UN Ocean Sciences Decade for the Sustainable Development 2021-2030 programs, and they are focused on conservation areas in order to know the biological conservation with joint cruises and scientific collaboration with the capacity development and ocean literacy, as well as we're looking at the action opportunities that the three countries integrate climate change and to know the emergence and forecasting in the effects that they have, like the oxidization, the priority identification, and with this to foresee and to redesign and design the natural protected areas, identifying priorities and having better decisions with better scientific knowledge. With this, I conclude. We have the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement, USMCA, and we have these articles, and the Article 24, which is focused on the environment, but with these 4 articles to focus that the conservation of marine species include marine mammals, fisheries, and birds. I conclude here in order to have a discussion later on. Thank you very much. And to remember that above all, the oceans are connected to the life of this planet, especially human life, with an exchange between the continent and other continents and the transportation of resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elva. I have 2 brief questions for you, and then we will open up for questions for the entire panel. So first off,
Tengo 2 preguntas y luego continuamos.
could you please elaborate just a bit on how the work you are advancing through the UN Ocean Decade working groups can help and inform MPA personnel, and that being the capacity building working group and also the ocean literacy working group that you are associated with?
Okay, thanks, Mary. I had to change my translator because otherwise I couldn't really follow your question. But let me see. What I understand is, again, what is next? Or again, can you please
I can repeat for you. That's fine.
Synthesize it, please.
So we're interested to hear more about the working groups that you are associated with through the UN Ocean Decade, that being the capacity building working group and the ocean literacy working group and their benefits
I lead
for MPA.
those 2, actually. We submitted the proposals early last year in the call from last year. We submitted a couple of proposals, and I lead those 2 through IOCaribe. This is for the Atlantic, but it does not leave the Eastern Tropical Pacific behind. We include those because the nations that along the Central America and Mexico, we share both oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic. So I lead those 2, but I participate in Challenger 150. I participate in Jetson, and I participate in Marine Life 2030. And I think that from those potential sites, we can involve the marine protected areas. I suggest as well that I put here a couple of ideas that we should probably consider the digital twins as one of those areas in which the the marine protected area should participate. Digital twins of the regional ocean where species can be modeled and scenarios generated for the climate change. In our regions in particular, as I mentioned, the oxygenation, the warming, the reduced food availability, acidification, and the effects that larvae and their food sources can have. Digital twins can allow as well the potential risks. I mean, I don't participate in that, but I know the project very well. And I think it will allow marine protected areas to understand better the potential risks from climate change and pollutants and litter.
Wonderful, thank you. And just to wrap up this little section, I'd love to ask, what's next for you?
Okay, for me, it's the deep ocean. It's larger in the ocean and the planet. And I think its importance for that reason is important for the species connectivity and the survival in the future with the climate change in a changing ocean. I also consider that we should, and it is an advice, we should include traditional and local knowledge to decision making. We have left these knowledges behind for a far long time. And in many of the coastal areas where we have a marine protected area, we have excluded these communities, and maybe even they don't live in North America in many locations anymore. Talking to my colleagues in Florida, for instance, with the problem of the sargassum, we saw that these communities are not there anymore. They have been pushed away from the coastal zone, and the coastal zone has been developed in such a way that in many of these areas, many of the different structures that are required to protect the coastal zone are not there anymore, like deteriorating coral reefs, the loss of seagrasses, and the loss of mangroves, because we now have urban sites and we have more touristic sites.
Perfect. So now we'll open it up to a few questions while they prepare the breakout groups that are open to all of these panelists for discussion. So the first question is, given how climate impacts can alter species interactions and the marine system balance, are there predictive models or other tools that can represent these changes and inform management decisions?
I'll just start to answer. Definitely, there are like many ways to better predict responses and effects of management. I think there are many models that focus on single species of populations. There's many models that focus on entire ecosystems as well. I think where there's most advancement needed is to include diversity or many species into one model, which is one of the challenges, I would say. But definitely there's many tools that can be used.
I would probably think that the largest challenge, in my point of view, from the different tools that are available, is how to transmit the uncertainty.
Yeah. And
the other one is scales. We have information that has different scales, like species have a very, very small scale, currents have a larger scale, or images coming from remote sensing have a very large scale. How to embed all these different scales together for decision making. I would think that is one of the largest challenges.
And I would agree with Eva about expressing uncertainty. It's a concept that's hard to convey to the public as well, because when we talk about uncertainty as a scientist, it appears that we don't know anything, and as opposed to trying to qualify the extent of our confidence in what we're saying. I think the other challenge with models is validation. It's easy to create models to make predictions, but how good are those predictions? And in most cases, you want to have independent models and look for other models and look for consistency between them.
Wonderful. Thank you all. So on one side, we have using scientific data and sharing it across borders, such as predictive models and projecting those results. And then on the other side, we have social systems and we have people. So I would like to hear from each of you if you have something to share about how to bring communities and people together across borders for the planning or management of protections.
Oh, jumping in again. I think in my experience working with people from different countries, one thing that's very important is to be able to bring the different perspectives together. We are all thinking in different ways. We use different languages, we have different cultures, we have different priorities. And I think when we work with social systems, we work with people, and we have to be able to, satisfy and listen to everyone and find ways that bring people together. And I think that's something that I found really hard in my work. And it would be true within a country and across borders, but I think that when we do across borders, we have many more challenges.
Right. And very briefly, what was difficult about trying to achieve that in your work?
In my work, I worked a lot with experts from developing countries. And I think that when we speak with scientists from the US, or when we speak with scientists from Indonesia or from Russia or from Korea or from West Africa, or, all of these countries, they have very different political agendas, but they also have different capacity. And they sometimes they cannot focus on the same questions. And so they wouldn't necessarily have the same incentive to work together. So in some countries, the most important challenge is to reach sustainable fisheries and do single species assessment within a country. And there is not yet this cross-border focus. And so it's hard to bring everybody together to think about the question.
Wonderful, thank you. I know Elva started talking briefly beforehand, so please continue. And we still can't hear you.
Actually, to have a more efficient communication, I think that we need very much to have better capacity development on one hand, and ocean literacy provides a great way of bringing in basic knowledge to everybody, and also including knowledge that is acquired by local people. When we talk with local communities, we need to better understand how they understand the ocean, how they use the ocean, and why they use the ocean, and why the ocean is important to them. So in my point of view, co-design, co-development, and co-delivery of whatever we do in relation with marine protected areas and with acquiring knowledge from the ocean is important. It will help planning with human beings and with their needs. It will be important for the success of the marine protected areas. Politicians are humans as well. And I think this efficient communication is a serious problem because there are very big differences. Scientists, we usually like to explain the discovery potential of what we find. New species, how species are distributed, how they connect. But the politicians require resolutions of social and economic problems that require to be solved immediately at the same moment. And they don't know how to achieve that objective, especially if the solution involves science. So in my point of view, they expect these solutions to be immediate, and science has a very different time frame. So in my point of view, the answer is different for every type of stakeholder, for the decision maker, for the politician, and again, probabilities and uncertainty are important to transmit. So the politician expects one answer with no uncertainty, but the ocean is very uncertain. It occurs variably at different times of the year for different purposes.
Wonderful.
From my
Andrew, do you have something to
perspective,
add?
Yeah, the challenge I see is figuring out who should be at the table. And as we talk about stakeholders, and there's so many different stakeholders for all the different issues, that you have so many people around a table that very little gets accomplished, it seems. And so I guess I sort of look at this as like an onion. If you can figure out who the key ones are at your core of your onion, and you're going to do most of the heavy lifting, and then you bring in at the next level and the next level. But often the issues I've been involved with, it seems that everybody wants to be there on day one. And it seems that outside of a bit of posturing, very little of serious substance is really discussed. And I think the key is figuring out who should be there at the core of the onion, and how many layers do you add on, and how do you develop your onion over time.
Great insights. So I see a few more questions coming in the chat, and I want to note briefly that we'll come back to those questions, but after we get a chance to all break out into the breakout rooms. I want to thank our expert panel today for sharing such insightful work and interesting work. And I want to note that as we transition into the breakout groups, each group will be responsible for nominating an individual to, when we all come back together, give a moment to discuss what you talked about and some of the key points or challenges that you discussed in your groups. So make sure you nominate somebody within the next hour while we're in those breakout sessions. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Catherine.
Thank you, Mary, and to all of our panelists for your wonderful presentations. As Mary mentioned, we will now move into our breakout group portion of the event, where we will split up into groups around the topics of marine mammals, seabirds, fish and sharks, and a generalist group. We will return to this main room from our breakout groups at 3:20 Eastern Standard Time. So we have about an hour to do that. And yeah, we can go ahead and get sent to our rooms. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope your breakout sessions went well. I am going to pass the event back along to our moderator, Mary, who is going to take us through our cross-group discussion.
Perfect, thank you. So we'll start with those groups that are oriented along the East Coast. And so was there an East Coast Fisheries and Sharks group that would like to report back?
I believe they might have been combined into one group, one fisheries and.
Okay, I believe that was my group. So the East and West Coast Fisheries and Sharks group can do their reporting now.
Hello, everybody. So I think that's me, and I will ask my group if I forget something that they can add in at the end. So I'll just raise a few of the main points that we discussed. We had a really good discussion about, and varied discussion about the two questions. So I will also say that none of us were MPA managers. We're more people that support MPA practitioners. So that was, we answered the questions not direct way they were worded. So on the one about documenting change under management response for fish and sharks looking at transboundary levels. So there is a lot of documentation about changes. So on the East Coast, there's lots of, species are moving north, whether there be lobster, halibut, or great white sharks. And then on the West Coast, there's also a lot of examples of people observing changes in species distribution. And again, a lot of it is species moving north, like the Pacific salmon. And some of the challenges are management hasn't really responded to a lot of these changes in species distribution, but what the group was talking about was a lot of the challenges that we assess these stocks. Often they're species of commercial interest, so we're assessing the stocks separately in different jurisdictions. So Canada does their assessment of a species and they'll say, oh, it's healthy because they're all moving north. And the US will do their assessment and they'll say, oh, it's at risk here because they're all moving north. So the idea of like having coordinated and working better together across jurisdictions to assess the same species, not at a jurisdictional level, but as a sort of the whole range of the species. And then the other example of a management response that was able to enable that assessment is an example from the West Coast was basking sharks are a species at risk in Canada. So there was able to be an assessment that within the recovery strategy, it noted that Canada, US, and Mexico have to take actions together or work together. So that was sort of like having that few lines and a high level plan that was signed off allowed, or between the three countries, allows sort of the practitioner levels to start working on actions and measures to help the species together. So that was an example of an example of an effort that's sort of underway for the basking shark, but mostly it was this idea that there's sort of a mismatch between how we assess a lot of these species without considering the boundaries, and then that they're moving across boundaries. And then for the second question about the role of networks, for this one, it was that the networks could help a lot with standardization of data collection. Like if we're all using the same metrics, and in particular, the potential or the need or the role that a connectivity indicator could play. So as Mary was mentioning at the beginning, those idea of developing or international standardized indicators for connectivity could really help both individual sites show how they're contributing to connectivity and improving it. And then that idea of just the networks could be a way to share data expertise across boundaries. And one example was just knowing who to call from, that there's an MPA near yours on the other side of the boundary, but you don't know how to reach out or connect with that person or those people. And then the idea of building on existing partnerships and networks. So there was an example of on the West Coast, the Salish Sea, where there's already a lot of discussion between Canada and the US on the southern resident killer whale. So like building on those partnerships and maybe expanding those partnerships to include data experts and going like across disciplines within those existing partnerships. So not just make it about management. And so if you're thinking of fisheries, it's not just the stock assessment people and the quotas, but bringing that science and monitoring and different disciplines and stakeholders into those discussions for the network. I think that was the high level points. Does anybody have anything to add from our group?
That sounded wonderful to me. Thank you. So next, since the fisheries and sharks groups were combined, we'll move on to those who were engaged in marine mammal discussions. And we'll start with a review of the East Coast Marine Mammals Group. And then after that, we'll shift to the West Coast before then finishing up with the generalist groups. So East Coast mammals.
All right, so I was asked to report back. We had a great discussion, and it was great to listen to practitioners that are working in the field and in MPAs. So in terms of the documenting change, We talked about how the collaboration on the science side is very good. There's a lot of data in terms of marine mammals. There's work being done on monitoring prey and how monitoring prey can help understand the movement of marine mammals and range shifts. And then we talked about with the North Atlantic right whale, the collaboration that's been ongoing between Canada and the US since 2017. And that includes sharing information quite regularly on sightings, and that it helps inform the management responses. And there's some tools that are more nimble that can be implemented quickly. Like voluntary measures for shipping, and then the longer term tools that might with more regulatory measures that can take longer to implement. And we talked about in terms of we talked about the related to Andrew Trites' presentation when he spoke about what are the weak points in management. If you're doing everything you can in one area, what are some challenges that you have, even if you have the information? And we talked about if you're managing an area where it's a feeding ground, but the reproductive area is outside of your jurisdiction, either in another country's waters or just in the high seas, how that can complicate your management response. And then we talked about the network and how the example of the right whale in crisis situations, there's quite a good collaboration and how that can be fostered at other times. And Terry from NOAA left us on a hopeful note that even when that collaboration, cross-border collaboration is fostered, happens in a crisis, that builds connections between people who might have a side conversation about another issue that they're seeing in their MPA. And then, as Chantal mentioned too, that then they can pick up the phone and talk about that. And we talked also about how the network can help. The science side is already quite strong, the collaboration, and management, you can share management ideas, but then on the policy, each country has a different priorities and different policies. And so at what point does collaboration and management come into play? And if anyone in my group wants to add anything, please go ahead.
Thank you, Lauren. That was a wonderful summary. This is Eric here at EcoAdapt. I just wanted to emphasize that this idea of what we're seeing, I think, repeated is the collaboration at the science level. It seems stronger and growing and been quite productive. But how can we and how can the network help translate that into good policy that works across political boundaries, especially as species are moving and shifting rapidly due to climate change? We have to make sure those connections are there, the management is strong, and the support is strong on throughout species life cycles. So that was a wonderful output from the group. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric and Lauren. So next we'll shift to West Coast mammals and their reporting. Do we have anybody speaking for West Coast marine mammals?
Listo. Mil disculpas. Tenía.
I'm sorry. I was muted. Our group, West Coast Marine Mammals, there was a small group, and that allowed us to go deep, to have a deep dive. To start with, I would like to highlight that the most important outcome was that Irma and Andrew were able to meet each other, the two persons that were discussing this topic most of the time. This will allow to have a connection between the development of MPAs in the Gulf of California and the development of scientific information. So I think that will be the best outcome from this meeting. Our discussion was very interesting because we were able to focus on a phenomenon that is currently happening on the islands of the Gulf of California. And this is specifically happening in the Rock of Animas in San Jose Island. We just recently looked at an increase, a major increase of the fur seal. There were 20 or 30 fur seals, and now we can see thousands of fur seals. So this derived in a very interesting discussion. First of all, we had to talk about two different approaches. The first one, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. We lost him.
I think he just might have lost connection, so maybe we can move to the next group.
Okay, thank you. And I'll give anybody else in that group just a moment here for if they'd like to add anything else that wasn't touched on already.
A lot of our discussions was focused on recovering species and keeping in mind what we understand their current distributions to be compared to what their historic distributions might have been when we have no information. And we focused on both the terrestrial needs of the seals and sea lions plus their aquatic needs and how that differs between countries. So yeah, so I think that may have been where Amy was going to go and bring up some of those points.
Thank you. Okay, so now we'll take a look at the generalist groups and what they were able to cover in their sessions. So we'll start with the East Coast or Atlantic generalist group.
So Mary, which one we were? I thought with the two generalist group were actually merged into one.
Oh, perfect. Well, if they were merged and we have a representative, then
Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay, thank you. So Mari Carmen Garcia is going to provide the report. Thanks.
Gracias. Pues como buen grupo
Thank
generalista.
you. So as a generalist group, we talked about many things, and many managers and people that are actually in the that are part of the policymakers. So we follow the questions, and if we document the changes in the species that was briefly mentioned, but the most important thing was to identify connectivity and identify those areas, those key areas to be able to have a real map or as real as possible. And with the climate change, some species are now migrating, and that is important to highlight. And the predictions, sometimes work and sometimes they cannot give an answer to the MPAs because we have the day-to-day activities, but in general, we need to have a very good scheme to look at this as a matrix, identify those connected areas and those key sites. And in relation to how the NAMPA network can help. Well, our colleagues from Canada, they talked about the Great Lakes and how the committee has been very successful because there are many people from different sectors involved with the lines that are common to all those individuals for transboundaries issues. They gather on regular basis, and it is important to have a person that can create this connectivity. So it is important to have a network to be able to meet people to reach out to very specific. They talked about the loss of tissue of the coral reef, for instance, how these emergencies can also be addressed more rapidly through an early warning in this kind of network. And the networks also help us get some funding. But the most important thing is to scale this up to public policies. And the heads of our 3 countries just had a meeting and how NAMPAN can influence to change the policies. So it is important to drive and foster the policies through the NAMPAN network. We talked about many other things, but I don't know if anyone in my group would like to elaborate a little bit more on what I've just touched upon.
Thank you, Mary Carmen. I don't hear any additional participants. So we'll continue on. Before we go back to questions for our panelists to fill out this hour, I have a quick question for Catherine. And that would be, would we like to pose questions that were included in the chat targeting specific individuals who were presenting today, or would we like to focus on some of the general questions, or both?
I think first we have our Seabirds group that didn't get to go yet. And then
oh, wonderful. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry
Yeah.
about that, everybody. I didn't mean to leave
problem.
you out. Seabirds, please share your takeaways from today.
Yeah, thanks so much. We had a great discussion, so happy to share that. I will say we talked about impacts and the role of networks, and we had some really good dialogue. We heard from Greater Farallones and Cornell Bank off the coast of California about the habitat compression. So this is the movement of available habitat for key seabird species, especially moving in toward the shoreline and putting them more into a conflict with human uses, including fishing, shipping. This is true for not only seabirds, but also marine mammals. So there's this compression of area that's available to that species. And so it really requires more intervention in terms of management of human activities in that coastal area. One of the other comments was that a lot of MPAs lack observations for birds. And so there's a great opportunity to increase observations and understanding of birds within MPAs. And even when there are bird observations, a lot of times they focus on bird breeding areas rather than the full range of activities occurring across the range of seabirds. We also talked about the challenge of adapting static management to rapid changes in the marine environment. This is true for seabirds, but also for other species. And the opportunity to use seabirds as indicators of environmental change and also of ecosystem health, of aggregations of marine mammals or prey species, because they are visible, they can be tagged, they can be detected through remote sensing or other types of indicators. So we also talked about the opportunity to integrate indigenous knowledge into our understanding of seabirds, the continuing concerns about bycatch that's outside MPAs, and that basically the primary management response has been to try to increase resilience by changing human impact, for example, by trying to limit fishing impacts to seabirds. And then in terms of the role of networks, we talked about the challenge of creating marine protected areas that have specific boundaries when we have wide-ranging species that use huge ocean areas outside those boundaries, and how it can be difficult to convince ocean users that this is a good use of space, and also conservationists may not be satisfied that we're protecting, the right areas or providing sufficient protection. And so that's when we got back to this idea that MPAs often need to be complemented with other kinds of measures, particularly ones that can be quickly responsive. We had a great comment that there seems to be less capacity for bird monitoring in Mexico. It doesn't seem to be as well developed as it is in the other two countries, and that perhaps we could do more capacity building and citizen science to integrate birds into ocean research and also into outreach at MPAs. And then lastly, we had a good discussion about the potential of the UN Ocean Decade as a possible source of funding for research on transboundary species. And thought that NAMPAN and networks could potentially play a role in identifying opportunities in terms of funding and research on this topic. So I'll stop and see if my group has anything else they would like to add. All right, thank you.
Actually, you were very precise. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. So we're going to backtrack a bit. Apparently, we do have a second generalist group, and we'd love to hear from them. And then after that, I'll ask if Jaime, who is now back online, has any very brief additional comments to make about his group discussion after he was dropped. So next generalist group.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. The other group that was formed for general groups, general topics, I'm sorry, they asked me to ask, because I'm new in this, I'm new at marine protected areas, so I'm going to try to summarize. We touched on several topics, and I think that it is very important. The topic of transboundary species. We talked about turtles, marine turtles. There's a program in the leatherback turtle in the border of Mexico with Texas, specifically in the whole Gulf of Mexico. I think that this is a very good project, but we are detecting a general problem in the Gulf of Mexico in the habitat of the leatherback turtle. In the general information in this area, in the area of Rancho Nuevo, all the way to Campeche. With the carey turtles in the Gulf of Veracruz, there's these type of problems. We also talked about the flow of connectivity, because this is a very positive topic for the distribution of different species of fish and seashell and shellfish, I'm sorry. And they talked about the topic of the lionfish, and we have detected in the Veracruz area, which is on the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico, and to the northern side in the area of Tuxpan. And this is another marine protected area. We also talked about the topic that has to do with marine ecological systems linked to large urban areas, for example, in the area of Cancun and on the Mayan Riviera. And it is also happening in the Veracruz area. This is a very large urban area. And there we also have the port of the largest port of in Mexico for the export and import of merchandise, which is at the port of Veracruz. And marine transportation has increased a lot. And this has effect on marine noise for different species, and also effects in the reefs because of the constant traffic. And other topics like wastewaters and solid municipal waste, that they don't have the adequate management and they have an impact on marine areas. We also spoke about that under these systems, it is important to promote ecological ordinance policies, that they are efficiently enforced, because there are marine or coastal dunes that they are occupied and they have effects on the beaches, and they affect different species. Also, the topic of birds, and another topic was migrant birds. And this is a problem that we saw at the end of last year. It was an alarm, and there was a work group, and it was developed in interinstitutional. We activated all the protected areas that have marine coastal areas, and to protect marine birds. We only had an alert, and this hasn't been a very big problem, but here we don't know what is the management on the side of the United States and Canada. But this is information that we have to include, because we have to know about these type of diseases and these type of problems that are vectors of migrant birds. And we also talked about in these spaces of transboundary spaces. We talked that in the Gulf of Mexico, the saline areas that has impact on the Atascosa port. And it is important to see these ecosystems for the conservation of marine spaces, which are very important for the feeding of turtles. And something that was also mentioned on the Pacific side is this problem of the forests that are being lost because of a growth of because of the water warming of the hedgehogs. And there's a problem there. And we also talked about the dispersion of more than 300 kilometers from the border in the United States and Mexico, in the area of California and United States, and the peninsula of California. On the marine side, the dispersion of larvae that has been seen in the border, but it has had effect because of the climate change. And we had to see what is the impact on the fishery and the community fisheries, and what they call the coastal fishery. And they are very related to the indigenous communities on the side of Mexico. We don't have too much of this work, except if the Tuxtlas biosphere, there's an indigenous community and they have territorial cultural activities, but they don't have too much fishing activity. But there's not too much link. And they talked about environmental culture, environmental education, especially in the coastal areas. And we also talked about this of the manglers. And basically, I don't know if I forgot something, and if anybody from the group wanted to mention anything more.
Thank you, Jose.
Mary,
a topic that was discussed in our work group was that in the studies, they're using the socioeconomic consequences that have this type of connectivity, and that there are studies, and we should look more into them.
Thank you very much. Okay, so finally, we'll ask Jaime to include anything very briefly additional that he wasn't able to include in his previous recap, if he's still here.
Muchas gracias, Mary.
Thank you very much, Mary. They told me that I already had information that was added. I apologize because I was disconnected. We spoke about marine mammals in the, and it was already explained.
Great.
And they talked about the Guadalupe first seal.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for sharing what you discussed in your breakout session. Some really fascinating concepts and ideas and intriguing challenges that were able to be captured through the notes. So to wrap up today, we're going to ask each of our panelists from the first portion of this meeting to, in one sentence, and I'll give you a little bit to prepare your one sentence, or a little bit more. What's one key way that managers can better act towards progressing ecological connectivity? And I understand that Elva may have needed to log off at this point, but we'd love to hear from the two additional. What's one way managers can better act towards progressing ecological connectivity?
I would say work with scientists and with your neighbors.
Wonderful.
And from a Canadian, whoops, I don't know what's happened to my video. From a Canadian perspective, I'd say there's often a disconnect between management and science. And I feel the two should be working more closely together to share information, to identify knowledge gaps, as well as to find common solutions.
I would probably say more ocean literacy for all, especially in school for teachers and for students, for the new generation of managers looking to the future.
So great. Thank you all. And with that, I'll give the mic over to the organizers of the event to wrap us up for today.
Thank you, Mary. I think we do have a couple more minutes if any of our panelists wanted to give some final remarks or summary of what they took away here. We also have the chat box open if there are a couple more questions anyone would like to ask our panelists while we're here.
I was going to say thank you for having us. It was really interesting discussions overall. So
there were two questions that were written earlier in the session that I can paste again into the questions bar. Would that be useful?
Sure.
Okay, to everyone. And I believe these were both from Barbara Lauschi to Elva and Aurore.
Mary, I think I already answered directly to Barbara. But if you can provide them my email, I will be very happy to expand. And I really have to leave. So I apologize for not being able to stay longer. And I really express my gratitude for this invitation and being able to speak here and join the meeting today.
Thanks, Elva.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elva.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
all right, I will quickly say I don't know because I have never discussed with people from the industry. Unfortunately, however, I would assume that no-take zones might be better received if they're temporary or if they are more dynamic than if they are forever and permanent. That would be the only thing I can say. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And that was in response to a question posed by Barbara Lauschi about commercial fisheries stakeholders and their receptivity about no-take zones within marine protected areas or as marine protected areas. Thanks.
Thanks, Aurore.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you to all of our panelists for the wonderful discussion and your presentation. And thank you to everyone who was able to participate today. I hope you had productive conversations in your breakout groups. It sounds like you did. We will be taking the notes from today's session and creating a summary document that will include some of the resources that were shared as well. So we will provide that to you all once it is complete. Again, thank you all so much for joining. And if any of the organizers have something else to say, go ahead. But otherwise, that's it for us. Thank you again.
Right. Thank you, everybody. This is very interesting and informative.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Good luck with your work.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.